Hi, welcome to the Economic Front. I'm Dr. Dave Hayes. Want to talk about the debut of sanctions, the economic weapon of World War One. Now, a great book on this topic, and from which I've gotten a lot of stuff I didn't know because like a lot of people, I've studied sanctions in the post World War II context. But Nicholas Mulder wrote about the economic weapon, how in World War One the concept of blockade got transformed into this kind of organized non-intercourse, this isolation of people, and the attempt to basically starve nations economically as a form of coercion, and how it kind of starts out as being an adjunct of war and becomes its own thing with the League of Nations as an alternative to war. So an excellent book. And let's just look a little about what happened in World War One. Now, everyone knows, or maybe you don't, that maybe people think it's just World War II, but a lot of focus has been on U-boats, German U-boats, and the attempt to isolate, to interdict the transatlantic trade. And that's what we hear a lot more about. But what was more important was the more traditional blockade, where the Royal Navy and the French Navy, but really the Royal Navy, undertook to blockade the coast of Europe. And they had a lot of work, and at the time, you had a very globalized set of world system, and Britain had a very dominant power. And one of the things here we have a Royal Navy ship being coaled at a coaling station, and the British they controlled about 70% of the coal bunkers around the world, and they had this massive coaling system they were in control of, and so they were able to use that to good effect, and they were able to interdict a lot of trade with Europe, but they had to go beyond these old school blockading into new forms of it. So looking at the Anglo-French blockade, you had two approaches, and today this is still largely the case. The Admiralty approach was focused on trade, interdicting the trade, and it started out with just that, ships blockading ports and stopping neutrals and saying, hey, if you're going to go trade, you need to have your cargo inspected, etc. But it, and we'll talk about how that developed. But then there was the Treasury approach that looked at it and said, all right, we're not going to worry so much about the flow of goods. What we're going to worry about is the flow of money into the country and the balance of goods. And so you might still be interdicting trade, or you still might be trying to block it. But what you're looking at is the foreign exchange impact, because under the gold standard, which ruled at during World War One, and to a certain extent, in the interwar year, nations had to maintain a balance of inflows and outflows, and they had to keep that balance of revenue going, because any difference had to be made up with gold, and so you had a very limited amount of gold or foreign exchange, as the term goes, and if you could interdict one part of that and send it out of kilter, right, so that nations were forced to burn up their foreign exchange, there were points where you had Treasury officials who in the interwar years would, in the run up to World War II, would talk about, we can calculate to the day when the government would have to capitulate, because we can calculate when they'll run out of foreign exchanges. So the Treasury approach, very different, a little different for the Admiralty approach in terms of how they think it's going to work. And today we still see trade versus financial sanctions being very much part of it. I've tended to focus on trade sanctions, but increasingly with the focus on SWIFT and, which is the banking system that the Western nations have kind of a monopoly on, there's a lot of interest in that. So that's an important thing that comes out of this. Also, I keep saying interdiction of neutral shipping. This was a big problem for these guys, right? Is when they were fighting such a large war, and you had so many neutral nations that were, abutted Germany. So trade could come from a country like the United States, because in all of World War I, until the U.S. gets involved, the United States is the great neutral. The United States is this huge neutral power, does a lot of trade and with the world, and is not so. It was a fairly large commercial power, not and. What are you going to do about the U.S., right? And the Royal Navy, throughout this, right, one of the things the Royal Navy is like, under no circumstances are we seizing American ships. No, they've got the biggest navy other than ours out there. And yeah, so this, but also just the sheer volume of it became very difficult, that it just was impractical to divert, to divert ships to Britain to have their cargoes inspected, right? When they tried to say, all right, well, we're not going to let certain types of goods go in. You can't send weapons or material. You can't send manganese into, and we're going to stop. They did a lot of work on coming up with a contraband approach, right? Instead of saying, okay, we're going to have a blockade of the port, not let ships in. Well, we're going to declare certain things to be contraband. Well, how do you know what's on the ship? And it just became untenable. So you had this massive intelligence requirement, right? If you aren't going to stop the ships, just stop everyone coming in. Now you need intelligence. You need to know what's on the ships. You need to track world trade. You need to develop white lists and black lists, right? The the carte blanche and the noir, and because a lot of French terms are used. The point is, though, that the British had to set up this massive infrastructure. They actually had a ministry of blockade. They set up a whole ministry of it, and the Admiralty worked with a lot of other civilian folks, and they had to come up with this massive intelligence system. And one of the things that really helped them, going back to the bunker, that coaling, right? The British have this bunker system around the world. And so before SWIFT, there's the bunker system. And the British were able to effectively interdict trade by one of the tools in their quiver was they said to any ship, hey, any ship around the world, you want to get coal from one of our places, one of our bunkers, you have to have your cargo inspected and certify that you aren't taking contraband to a foreign nation or to a nation from where it could be transshipped. And so bunker control became this massive tool, and we get this very civilian commercialization of the blockade. And so this kind of, moves us in a new direction. And it starts to also, I think, foreshadow the problem of neutrality, right? Which I think is a massive thing when it comes to sanctioning. Sanctions also, as the economic weapon, were considered to be a terror weapon in World War I. And while you had kind of you had a little limited aerial bombing and you used gas on the battlefield, you didn't really have, it's not World War II levels of civilian death and destruction as the direct result of the war. So the blockade was actually the largest cause of civilian death in World War I. The estimates are that 300 to 400,000 people were killed in Central Europe, and about 500,000 in the Ottoman provinces in the Middle East. So that's, was fairly, this is still an era where most of the fighting happens on the battlefield, right? And so civilian deaths are not as common. So widespread suffering of civilians. And by the way, if that many people died, a lot more people suffered. So the deprivations were huge. And as they talked about sanctioning after the war, even, this idea that this is a horrible weapon, and I think these people who engaged in it frequently talked it up, right? They didn't shy from it. And this guy here, I've got a quote from Mulder quotes William Arnold Foster, one of the British sanctionists, one of the people that was involved in the ministry and all. He was a major figure in all this, and he talked about it afterward the war. He said, "We tried, just as the Germans tried, to make our enemies unwilling that their children should be born. We tried to bring about such a state of destitution that those children, if born at all, should be born dead." Whoa, dude. Nope. So that's how you really feel. But this was the way it was viewed. And the likes of Woodrow Wilson and other folks said, sanctions would be so horrible if you cut people off from trade. What nation would go to war if it faced that? And so the sanctions really came out of the war as this possibility to avoid war. And many of the people, you know, we are used to thinking in terms of the military, and we're used to hearing those stories that, oh, you invent the machine gun, and oh, we'll make war obsolete, and you invent, nuclear weapons, and supposedly that's, and we're used to that. But with sanctions, they were seen as that. And so the League of Nations is going to be set up to wield them as an alternative to war. However, Arnold Foster also gives us this little gem that Mulder, quoted him as saying, the economic weapon is one which is so infernally convenient to use that it naturally recommends itself to those who sit in offices. Pens seem so much cleaner instruments than bayonets, and can be handled by the amateur with so much less exertion, so much less realization of the consequences. That quote, I love that quote. And he was kind of recognizing that, that these things seem, he was part of the group who was going to say, oh, when it comes to starving women and children, we need to do that, right? Because we need to threaten to do it. It's a horrible thing, but we need to threaten it. And this sounds very much like nuclear weapons, right? Like, it's a horrible thing. Are we actually going to nuke someone? Well, our deterrence depends on people believing, no, if you push us too far, we will. And so these guys were talking this language, but at the same time, there isn't the abhorrence. He's recognizing there isn't an abhorrence of sanctioning. And while sanctions might have been a terror weapon, they also are emerging as a peacetime weapon. That when we come out of World War II, you're going to see a breakdown of the idea that you have a state of peace and a state of war, this kind of legalistic framework. And you could only use force. You could only, when you had this state of war, you declare war with another nation. Then you become a belligerent, and it's okay to go shoot, sink their ships and shoot their soldiers and do all sorts of nasty things to them. That's just the state of war. That's what it is. And sanctions or blockades were normally part of that. But sanctioning starts to move out of that to be a coercive measure that can be used outside the bounds of war. And even though, in the post-World War II era, no one declares war anymore, right? So, but back then it was a legalistic problem. And you saw sanctions, even though they were a terror weapon, breaking down this rigid, boundary between peacetime and wartime. So, the emergence of sanctions as a peacetime weapon is very significant. And it starts with the peace war. And the fighting of World War I stops with the armistice, November 11th, right? 11/11 at 11 a.m., right? And it basically 1918, right? Yeah. And the thing is that we go on in through 1919, 1920, until the Treaty of Versailles is settled. Sanctions are left in place. And so you start seeing that breakdown, right? That even though the fighting is stopped, well, the sanctioning is going to continue because we're going to keep the pressure on you until you sign the treaty. And so the idea that it's okay to do this, even though it led to mass deprivation, food riots, and a lot of resentment in Europe over it, in Central Europe, this becomes kind of a sore point, definitely. But also we have Article 16 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, and this, when they set up the League, this was the key thing, right? Article 16 was the mechanism by which you were going to sanction, and the League was going to they outlawed war, right? And we hear about the Kellogg-Briand Treaty, and we think, when I was taught in high school, oh, how naive to outlaw war. But the point of it was to say, no, nations were not supposed to go to war anymore as a means of settling things, and they were supposed to go through the League. And by doing it, you would now transgress the covenant, and you'd become a transgressor. And Article 16 it required that members of the League sever all trade or financial relations, prohibit all intercourse between nationals, prevent financial and commercial or personal intercourse between third parties when the League declared someone to be a transgressor. So you have this you have this mechanism, you have this requirement for nations not only themselves to not engage, but the League was really going to try to enforce the sanctions and the prohibitions on third parties and other people. And that is going to create a big problem because the United States is going to be the great neutral again because it's not part of the League. But what we can say about the future was the threat of Article 16 prevented two minor wars in the Balkans, right? Greece and Bulgaria, two separate wars, and that's a success. So Biden said that sanctions never deterred anyone. Well, they did it. They did stop two small wars in the Balkans. However, Article 16 did not fail to prevent Italy from invading Ethiopia or stop it once it got invaded, stop the war before they were able to conquer the whole nation. So the history is a bit complicated. And so I think, as we go forward, I'm going to have a presentation which will look at the Ethiopia example because I think that's very important and in a lot of ways a very obvious parallel to what has happened with Russia.